Hey everyone! So people have been asking me to review Milk and Honey for a while, and this is a poetry collection that going into it, I knew absolutely nothing about it other than it was popular and people had been telling me to review it, and that's about it. I kind of went in blind with absolutely no expectations. Now that I have read it, as I mentioned on one of my Instagram live streams the other day, I have mixed feelings about it. So in today's video, I am going to be giving you my general impressions of the book, reading a few poems from it, and talking about the ones that I liked and why I liked them, and talking about the ones that I didn't like so much, why I didn't like them, and how I think the poet could improve them. Now, the poet is Rupi, I'm afraid I don't know how to pronounce her surname, Kyrouac, forgive me, I'm terrible with pronunciation. I struggle with basic English words, never mind names. So we're going to be talking about this today. Unlike some other poetry videos, I'm not necessarily going to be comparing her poems to other poems saying, you know, this is better because this, but instead I'm going to be taking more of an approach where I look at her poems and talk about how she could have done better, what I would have done differently, what I'd like to see from them, and I'm going to try and be constructive in that way. So I guess first impressions would be that this book seems to fall into the category of content which gets popular because it's relatable, but that doesn't necessarily reflect its quality, which is incredibly ironic, actually, because one of her poems warns to never trade honesty for relatability, which is titled To All Young Poets. The irony. I can understand why some people do like the book, and on the one hand, you know, I kind of see this as a positive because at least it's getting people interested in poetry, and I can't really be too mad about that, can I? As I've said before, anything that gets people interested in a topic or art form they haven't really paid attention to before can't be all bad. However, I can't help but feel like the intention of this book was to write poems that were as vague as possible to appeal to as many people as possible, and I can't help but feel like the poet cared more about making something which looks like poetry on the page rather than actually caring about what's being said and how. It's this weird kind of genre of like aesthetic poetry, or kind of people sometimes call it Tumblr poetry or Instagram poetry, where it matters more about making it look like a poem than actually writing poetry. It's kind of like people write these vague sentences that sound kind of deep but that don't actually say anything, and then they throw in a few line breaks and call it poetry because, you know, as long as it looks like a poem on page, it's a poem. It definitely fits into that category, which is a bit of a shame. I have a lot of problems with that kind of poetry, as I've mentioned in many videos, and as we will discuss in today's video. That said, I actually think there are some really good poems in this book. There are some that I enjoyed, definitely some that made me think a lot. However, there are also plenty of poems that felt rushed, lazy, kind of like they were pandering to people rather than the poet actually cared about what she was saying. I worry that Milk and Honey is to poetry what Lele Pons is to sketch comedy, you know? It gets the views, there's definitely some interesting ideas in there, there's definitely a lot of money that goes into making it, and there's definitely a lot of money that can be made from it, but on the whole, it seems to focus on quantity over quality. And that's a real shame. So with that said, let's take a deeper look at a few of the poems and talk about the ones I liked and the ones I didn't. As always, I just want to preface this by saying this is just my opinion, and while I can say I think this is good or I think this is bad or whatever, I'm not here to tell you what you should or shouldn't enjoy. That's completely down to you. If you liked some of the poems that I'm going to be saying I didn't like, that's absolutely fine. If you didn't like some of the ones that I say that I do like, absolutely fine as well. Poetry is subjective in that you can like and enjoy whatever you want. There are some technical bits that might make it good or bad, but it doesn't matter. As long as you enjoy something, that's what's important. Look at my little Karoo bear. Such an angel. So the first poem in my book that actually grabbed my attention was this one. The first boy that kissed me held my shoulders down like the handlebars of the first bicycle he ever rode. I was 5. He had the smell of starvation on his lips, which he picked up from his father feasting on his mother at 4 a.m. He was the first boy to teach me my body was forgiving to those that wanted, that I should feel anything less than whole. And my God, did I feel as empty as his mother at 4:25 a.m. So not necessarily the best poem I've ever read, but I actually liked it. I thought it was pretty good. It has some pretty powerful imagery in there, especially in that first simile of, you know, the boy who held my shoulders down like the handlebars of the first bicycle he ever rode. I think that's pretty fantastic. You know, you think of this kid like clinging onto the handlebars of a bike and all those emotions he must be feeling, you know, at first feeling fear and clinging on for safety, but then getting braver. And as he does, getting more reckless, starting to feel in control, treating the bike as an object, feeling like he can control it, like he can direct it. It tells us a lot about how he treated her and viewed her and how helpless perhaps she felt. He was in control, you know, not her, and that's a pretty damn powerful image. It tells us not only about that first kiss, but how he treated her in general, even as a kid. The poem goes on to tell us about how she learnt to be treated by men from that first boy, and he learned how to treat women from watching his father who was clearly abusive to his mother. The poet, the narrator, she ends up feeling used and hurt exactly like the boy's mother. I think what's really clever about this poem is the imagery of the bicycle, not only because of that, you know, that powerful, important image of the boy clinging onto the handlebars, but also the idea of cycles in general is very important in this poem. It's about cycles of abuse, it's about cycles of learning, it's about where we pick up on, I guess, the way we treat people in life, you know. He was the first boy to teach my body was forgiving to those that wanted, and later, my God, did I feel as empty as his mother. Cycles of abuse, it's about repeating patterns we've seen before, repeating behaviours we've seen before. It's actually really clever and I really like it. Plus the imagery of starvation, feeding, feeling empty is really, really interesting as well. It tells us a lot about how some people view sexual encounters as a physical need and how, you know, you get these people who are like, oh, you can't blame them for just taking what they need, you know, withholding sex is so cruel, it's like withholding a basic human need. You know, they were just starving and they can't help it if they went too far, if they took too much, if they overindulge, you know, and that's where you get these images of feasting. And of course, interesting to note that it's always the men feasting on the women, while the women are left empty and children starve. That's quite telling, isn't it? Overall, this poem definitely has some pretty interesting commentary about gender roles, about sex, violence, about how we pass on these behaviours and these values to our children and to others, our peers as well. I like how this is a very universal message told through a very specific story. It goes back to what we were talking about in my intro to poetry video, the what makes a good poem one, about what was it called? Like, the Great Paradox, I think. Basically how the more specific something is, the more universal the appeal. That's definitely the case here. It's telling a very specific story, but the feelings it invokes and the images it conjures up is something that I think a hell of a lot of us can relate to. In terms of the structure and form for this poem, I think this is my only critique, because I think she was going for this whole aesthetic thing, simple looking poems with no punctuation or obvious structure, but honestly I didn't really see the point to it. I didn't get anything from it, it felt a little gimmicky. Yeah, there was no real kind of purpose here, it just kind of felt like it happened this way rather than she put any thought into it, and yeah, that's my one critique of that poem. So that was a good one, but on the other hand there were definitely some that disappointed me. For example, this one. You were so afraid of my voice, I decided to be afraid of it too. It's clearly going for a very similar kind of message to that last poem, in terms of having a very strong feminist undertone. You know, it's definitely making a statement about how women are silenced, maybe because, you know, if they did speak they'd have so much power, and that's what men are afraid of, and so men being afraid of women's power makes women afraid of their power. You know what I'm trying to say. It's a very strong feminist message. You have these things in there about internalized hatred and blah blah blah. Very important message, very important to talk about. It's just expressed lazily, and that's a shame. It's oversimplistic, it's underdeveloped, it's fairly generic, it's nothing original or new. And this definitely feels like a first draft, you know, an idea waiting to be developed, not a complete finished poem. Similar story with poems like this. Every time you tell your daughter, you yell at her out of love, you teach her to confuse anger with kindness, which seems like a good idea till she grows up to trust men who hurt her because they look so much like you. To fathers with daughters. Incredibly important topic, incredibly important subject, it's just expressed lazily. To me, this isn't a poem, you know, in the sense that the words aren't chosen with any real intention or thought. The line breaks feel random and without purpose. This is more of like a single sentence you'd see written in an essay. You know, it feels like the author wrote this one sentence and then couldn't be bothered to write the rest of the essay, so they just hit enter a few times and called it a poem instead, you know? There's no interesting structure, no interesting use of language or any poetic techniques, there's no intentional meter or rhythm. Yeah, even the lack of these things isn't intentional, they're just not there, and it's basic. As I've said in many of my videos, just because the subject or the message behind the poem is important, it doesn't mean you can get away with expressing it lazily. That doesn't make it a good poem. If I take a random sentence from one of my videos where I've spoken about something important and I isolate that sentence and add in a few random line breaks, that doesn't suddenly make it poetry, you know? Having a secular basis for education allows kids to learn only what is fact and make up their own minds about beliefs later. It's not a poem. The fact that someone could write something like this and then try and get it published and sell it and have people buy it as poetry, I find it kind of insulting. I don't know, it gives me mixed feelings, right? Because on the one hand, it's great that these really important topics are being shown to a mass audience, but I can't help but feel like it's a bit of an insult to the people who actually put time and effort and energy into crafting something beautiful with language. It's an insult to poets who actually spend time on their craft. I think I've received probably 60 odd submissions now for my Fresh Poets Society like isolation theme, and I'm so overwhelmed by just the quality of your guys' work. Like, it's amazing. There are some real gems in there, and there's some amazing stuff, and I'm so impressed. But more than anything, it's just shown me how much time and effort some of you guys put into your work, and it makes me sad that you don't get the recognition of something like this, which feels lazy in comparison to what you guys are sending me, you know? But it's the same with plenty of other poems in this book, and I'm sure I've said this exact same thing in my videos before, but just because you take the punctuation out and add some line breaks, it doesn't suddenly make it poetry. Sex takes the consent of two. If one person is lying there not doing anything because they are not ready or not in the mood or simply don't want to, yet the other is having sex with their body, it's not love, it is rape. Yeah, I have so many mixed thoughts on this, and it kind of makes me mad because, again, really important topic, something we should be talking about, something that is important to be expressed through art, something that it's great that it's being shown to a mass market, but this is something which could just as easily have been expressed in an essay or a tweet or a short story, and it just wasn't. If you want to be this straightforward and not put any effort into your writing, that's fine. You know, put together a ton of tweets and publish them. Put together a book of one-liners. Just don't add in some random line breaks and call it poetry. Once again, there's just nothing to say about this. It's about misconceptions and sex and rape, and that's it. There's nothing interesting in there that makes it poetry. There's no deeper meaning, no layers, no poetic techniques, no interesting language, no intentional form or structure or rhyme or rhythm, no allegory, no allusions, no nothing. That's not to say all simple poems are bad, right? There's actually, this one is one I actually think is quite good, right? And it's simple, it's short, but it's damn effective. He guts her with his fingers, like he's scraping the inside of a cantaloupe clean. Short, simple, basic, powerful. It works. There's brutal imagery in there. Lines like he guts her and scraping. It's a very graphic metaphor. Juxtapose those images with words like clean, and it tells you a lot about his intentions compared to what's actually happening, you know? Again, it says a hell of a lot about the differences between men and women and how they experience and view sex. And honestly, it's kind of uncomfortable to read because of this graphic, brutal, somewhat violent imagery. But that's the intention. That was why she's done it. That's what the poem's trying to do. It's trying to make you uncomfortable. And in that way, it works. And it's good. And it's powerful. And it does get you talking and thinking back to certain experiences you might have had. And brilliant. This one is one that I actually think is pretty good. The illustration, not so much. And that's the next thing I want to come on to, because this book features several illustrations. Some of them are quite lazy and pointless, like this. Kind of like the poem. You have sadness living in places sadness shouldn't live, and then it's two stick figures. It feels like they're just there to fill the page. This whole page feels like filler, to be honest. But on the other hand, there are some cases where I feel like the poet was making an attempt to make a point, but again, it was just kind of left underdeveloped. So this page is one that stood out to me in particular, right? The idea that we are so capable of love, but still choose to be so toxic. And then a drawing of a scorpion. A dodgy drawing of a scorpion, but, you know. And again, not really a poem, just a shower thought, but it does become slightly more interesting when you pair it with that illustration, because it reminded me a lot of the fable of the frog and the scorpion. Now, if you're not familiar with this, it's a really kind of interesting, thoughtful little tale, very basic. One day, a scorpion is wandering along a riverbank and he comes across a frog. And he asks the frog, "Will you carry me across the river?" The frog says, "Oh, I don't know if I can trust you. You might sting me and then, you know, I'll die." And the scorpion says, "Nah, mate, why would I do that? If I sting you as you carry me and you die, I die. We both drown. Why would I do that? It's silly." And the frog's like, "Logic, yeah, I get it. Okay, yeah, I'll take you across the river. Hop on my back." So the frog starts swimming across the river, Scorpion's on his back, they get about halfway across, and suddenly, Scorpion stings him. With his last dying breath, the frog's like, "Mate, why? Why? You've damned us both." And the scorpion says, "Yeah, I know, but it's just my nature." And then they both die. Interesting little story about how sometimes people and animals just do what comes naturally to them, even when it's not in their best interests. It's definitely the kind of little fable or story that makes you think about the whole nature versus nurture argument. And in that case, I kind of see why she's paired the image of that, if it is an allusion to that, with this poem, which is the idea of being capable of love but choosing to be toxic. It's about, you know, maybe love comes naturally to us, but some people choose to be toxic. Whereas in the scorpion fable, it's more about how, even though it might make more sense to be loving, sometimes it's in our nature to be toxic. It's kind of the opposite. And this is where it confuses me and feels a little underdeveloped, because I don't really know what the poet's trying to say. The line here that she calls the poem and the fable cover similar topics, but they kind of come to very different conclusions, and they have very different messages, you know? So what's her overall message? What is she going for here? What's she trying to say? Is it that we're all capable of love, but some people can't help it, it's just in their nature to be toxic? But then why have the word choose in the poem? I don't know. Or is she trying to say that... I don't know. I don't know what her ultimate message is trying to be. I can't get my head around it. It's like the poem and the image, like I say, are kind of almost suggesting opposite conclusions, and the poet doesn't know exactly which one to think, but she knows they're kind of related, and she knows they're kind of talking about the same things, but she didn't really want to bother putting time into developing her thoughts or opinions or views or how to express them, and so she just shoved it on the page and moved on. Which is a shame. I think it could have been really interesting. Next, I want to talk a little bit about her form and structure throughout this book, because I mentioned earlier that some poems feel like they were just, you know, sentences with random line breaks added to make it look like a poem. But there are actually some cases where the form and structure feel intentional, like they have actually been considered. There's a few poems where she plays around with different techniques and tries some unusual things, and it's great to see. It's really, really good, and it's one of the things I really commend about this book. Take this one, for example. We get one long run-on paragraph with many short, sharp sentences, and it creates this really fast pace, perhaps suggesting anxiety or fear or kind of racing thoughts, you know, that kind of thing. "You plough into me with 2 fingers, and I am mostly shocked. It feels like rubber against an open wound. I do not like it. You begin pushing faster and faster, but I feel nothing. You search my face for a reaction, and so I begin acting like the naked women in the videos you watch when you think no one's looking. I imitate their moans, hollow and hungry. You ask if it feels good, and I say yes so quickly it sounds rehearsed. But the acting, you do not notice." It's great, like the form and structure here. It's like this kind of stopping and starting of like anxious, 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 and then a little kick, a little punch, a little like shock of I do not like it. Hollow and hungry. You know, it's kind of the most important bits are kind of thrown at you with like, or thrust at you with like a little punch. I think it's great. It's very, very well done. It was a good choice. No complaints there. But sadly, these ones where you feel the form and structure is considered and intentional and done well are the minority in the book, and it's a real shame. Honestly, the majority of poems in this book fall back into the whole lazy 1 sentence, 5 lines structure, if you want to call it that, and it just feels a little disappointing because you know that the poet, she can do better. You know she can, you've seen it. And even when she doesn't quite hit the mark, you can see there's been an attempt made and it's great. And it's a shame when you see that because the rest of the book feels like filler. It feels like she's just chosen the easy option, the easy way out. And it's not necessarily that structure in itself is bad. It's the fact that it's both overused and that it's used so lazily and without purpose that's the issue. Like, look, you've touched me without even touching me. There's nothing to say about it because it's basic and lazy. Moving on to kind of like language and figurative language and stuff, there are some really interesting attempts at metaphors and allegories in this book, but unfortunately most feel underdeveloped. So one of the good examples was that poem we looked at in the beginning about the bicycle and the cycles of abuse and so on. But then on the other hand, you get examples like this, which could have been something really good, but again, it feels like a first draft. How do you turn a forest fire like me, so soft I turn into running water? And then there's a pretty awful illustration. Not a fan of that one. But the poem itself could have been so good. That contrast of the images of the forest fire and the soft running water could have been so lovely. There's so much she could have done with that. I'd have loved to have seen more descriptions about, you know, the fire blazing out of control, wild, dangerous, but free, obviously as a metaphor for her personality, her life. And then maybe as the poem develops, something happens, a storm, rain, a firefighter comes along and he's battling against the elements, tearing through hazy black smoke. And you know, that's kind of like a man coming into her life and changing her, taming her, controlling her. And then at the end, she's soft, calm, running water, you know, glistening in the sunlight. And it seems nice because she's calm and relaxed, but she's not free anymore. As water, as a river, she's contained within certain boundaries, and so now she feels like she's calm and stable, but she's not free anymore. She's been kind of fenced in a little bit, so she has to kind of discover a way to harness her power again without being destructive, or maybe sometimes to harness her power she has to be destructive, and we get some images in there of like erosion and so, I don't know, I'm getting carried away. The point is, there's so much she could have done with it. There's so much that could have been so interesting. She could have told a really wonderful story. She could have made the reader feel and see and think about so much. And instead, it was just left like this, like the first draft of an idea, and it's a real shame. Because funnily enough, these are kind of like the lines that I write in my notebook, like as the first ideas for a poem. So I'll write things like little images that come to mind, or like things I want to talk about, and you know, it might be like fire versus water, blah, blah, and stuff like that, but they're only ever like the first draft of a first draft. They're like the ideas that I kind of develop and work on and use to spark full poems. They're never finished work in themselves, and yeah, it's a shame. It's a shame. And then finally, the last thing I want to talk about in this video are the poems that I had more of an issue with because of what they were trying to say rather than anything else. So a lot of the poems I commended for their subject matter because I think they're talking about important things like rape, sexual assault, sexual violence, gender roles and gender issues, feminism, love, relationships, really important topics. Then some feel like an angsty teenager crying into a journal, lacking any self-awareness, you know? Like, this one reads like an angsty teenager who's shouting, "Boo, she'll never be as good as me, you missed out," about some guy she dated's next girlfriend. And it's just awkward and uncomfortable to read for all the wrong reasons. The woman who comes after me will be a bootleg version of who I am. She will try and write poems for you to erase the ones I've left memorized on your lips, but her lines could never punch you in the stomach the way mine did. She will then try to make love to your body, but she will never lick, caress, or suck like me. She will be a sad replacement of the woman you let slip. Nothing she does will excite you, and this will break her. When she is tired of falling apart for a man that doesn't give back what he takes, she will recognize me in your eyelids, staring at her with pity, and it'll hit her. How can she love a man who is busy loving someone he can never get his hands on again? I refuse to believe a grown adult wrote this. It's clearly a 16-year-old girl. No, but seriously, it's just, also how this woman can have so many strong feminist messages in some of her other works and then write like this just doesn't make sense to me. Same with this one, like, oh god, stop. It must hurt to know I am your most beautiful regret. Stop it already. And for me, I think one of the weirdest things as well is not just like this angsty teenage voice she has in some places, but the weird hypocrisy, as she can be like that on one page and be like, oh, well, you know, she'll never be me, I'm better than your next girlfriend, and all that stuff. And then on the next page, she can be all like, yeah, all women are great, women support women. It just makes no sense like this. Other women's bodies are not our battlegrounds. My heart aches for sisters more than anything. It aches for women helping women, like flowers ache for spring. Don't be one of those hypocrites who's like, yay, all women! Unless you're that ugly bitch dating my ex, in which case, screw you. There's like, the book is split up into kind of sections about kind of like, you know, like new love and this and this and this. And then there's like a breakup section. And I swear, this might seem cruel, I'm sorry, but a lot of the poems in this section read like something drunk girls say to each other, like when one of them is crying in the toilets of a club. I just have this image in my head of drunk girls crying to each other, hugging each other. They've never met before. And each line break in this poem is one of them stopping to take another sip of vodka lemonade, you know? It's like 2 a.m, you had a crazy night, you're slurring your words a bit, you're holding your drink, you got a lot of vodka in you, and you're like, when you are broken and he's left you, do not question whether you were enough. The problem was, you were so enough, you was not able to carry it. Let's do shots. Okay, no more of my drunk girl impression, even though that's exactly what I'm like when I'm drunk. No. I get very giggly when I'm drunk. I'm an absolute idiot. I'm very into bad dancing, it's great. When I say bad dancing, I just mean very enthusiastic dancing that I happen to be very bad at. So much fun. Anyway, sorry. I don't know why I did that. I'm probably gonna look back at that in like a month's time and cringe like hell. Anyway, there are also a lot of poems in this book which all just say kind of exactly the same thing, just in slightly different ways or with slightly different metaphors, and it's weird. It's like she wrote the same poem like 5 times, and instead of picking the best one, just put them all in to fill pages, you know? Like, here are 2 that are basically the same thing, you know? In these cases, it might have been better to, like, collect them into one poem and create some kind of cohesive narrative, but then, you know, I guess that wouldn't have filled as many pages, would it? I was your music, but you had your ears cut off. I am a museum full of art, but you had your eyes shut. And in these cases, again, they're just kind of basic and lazy. It doesn't feel like she made it so vague to leave it up to the reader's interpretation. It feels like she left it so vague because she couldn't be bothered to expand it anymore. I, for one, would love more of an explanation for why he didn't see the beauty or the art. Was it because he couldn't? Because he had his ears cut off? Did someone else hurt him, so he was unable to really open his heart to anyone? Or was it because he had his eyes shut, because he just wasn't looking for a relationship, because he was distracted by something else? Was he scared? On the one hand, I do enjoy how open-ended and ambiguous these lines are, but I'd like a few more hints and clues and pushes in a certain direction. I'd like a little more to think about than just basic cliches. I'd like a little more development. You know, it's a common idiom to tell someone to open their eyes, you know, to realize or notice something in their life. It's just very basic, and I'd like a little more, you know? And I guess that's my overall summary for this book. It has a lot of potential, and I know she's going on to write other books, which I might look at and see if she does get better over time, but I see a lot of potential that just hasn't quite been fostered. It's not been nurtured. She's not really developed anything. And I just like a little more. Yeah, and with that is basically my review of Milk and Honey, along with my weird drunk girl impersonation. Let's never talk about that again. Please let me know down in the comments if you've read this book and what your thoughts were on it. Let me know if there are other books or poetry or anything else you would like me to make videos on down in the comments below. I do read all my comments. Oh, also as a fun side note thing, if you guys can help get me to 200,000 subscribers, I am going to make a video celebrating where I read some of my cringy attempts at poetry, and you guys can rip it apart and be as brutal to me as I am to all of these poets. Bearing in mind, I've only started this up again in the last, I don't know, 6 or so months, so yeah, they're gonna be bad. They're gonna be bad. So you can be as harsh as you would like. But for now, thank you for watching. I appreciate you guys so much. Don't forget to like the video, subscribe if you want to see more terrible poetry, and I'll see you again very, very soon.